Welcome back to another episode of Epic Exchanges. I am super excited today to have Rosemary Holbrook as my guest, and I can't wait for you all to hear her story. Welcome, Rosemary.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so short version, I guess, introduction wise, without the whole story, is now I'm a yoga teacher. I specialize in sort of like therapeutic astrology, and there's a reason why, more than just I like astrology and it's fun. Therapeutic astrology to personalize yoga practices because yoga was so healing for me. So I'm a yoga teacher. It's, I guess, what I tell people at parties, but we can get into more of the details.
Great.
What I do.
Well, you've kind of made us interested to know more. So why don't you tell us your story?
Okay, so I'm going to go all the way back. I was born in a super small town in North Carolina. So I am like country girl to the max. Like, I have a pair of cowgirl boots. I ride dirt bikes with my husband. I make the meanest chicken and dumplings, right? Okay. And so I was born in this small town, grew up my family was Episcopal, but that's kind of weird. Like, we're in the Bible Belt here and almost everybody's like Southern Baptist. So on the weekends, I would go to Episcopal church with my family, and I would go to like Southern Baptist church with some of my friends that live down the street. And I would go there on Wednesday nights for like the youth group and stuff. So I was raised really like immersed sort of in Christian culture. I used to do like the church plays, and I really loved it. I loved being part of that so much that when I was in elementary school, I like asked my mom if I could go to Christian school instead of public school, and she said yes, and I did. And that was a weird experience. I don't know. That's not like the hugest part of my story. It matters, like the big unraveling that I went through in life wasn't really so much related to religion, but it's something I sort of like think about a lot these days as a yoga teacher, like growing up in this super Christian culture and like I was baptized and saved and altar calls. I was all into that kind of stuff growing up. And then, so Christian school was kind of the first thing where I was like, this is a little much, because the Christian school I went to, it was a little much. Like, we missed class for chapel and all this anyway. So I kept going on this super, like, I thought I had like the picture perfect, like Southern, my parents were together until I was like 12 or 13. I had a brother, had this like sort of picture perfect childhood, right? On paper is like, I had a great childhood. Like, we had toys, we were doing all right. And then I got to like middle school and my parents split up, and that was like pretty traumatic. So I do trauma work now, and I'm not the kind of person, it's from everything I've learned through this trauma work, is that reliving the story, like, I don't know that I need to like tell you all the harsh details about the time for folks to resonate and relate, but like, there was some pretty traumatic stuff that went on with my dad at the time. And it was the sort of like first unraveling of my life, of this like picture perfect childhood. None of my friends' parents were divorced. You know what I mean? I didn't at the time like see that as a trauma. And now neither do I equate that as like the reason. Like, what we're getting to is I ended up on drugs towards the end of high school. I ended up addicted to drugs. And these are just sort of like seeds that led me there. That was the first sort of unraveling in my life, of my parents splitting up, my like dad that I idolized being no longer sort of like this perfect guy. And then moved on through high school. So that was in middle school. I was like tapped into the swim team. I, was in the art club. I was doing all these things. I was taking AP classes. I was like your all-American girl kind of, you know what I mean? Like doing the stuff. I wasn't like, Miss Popular, like homecoming queen or anything, but moving through high school, like, I had a pretty, I guess, quote unquote, like normal American upbringing, I guess. And then I went like junior, senior year, I was dating a guy in the Marine Corps, so he was older than me. I was like still in high school and he was in the Marine Corps, and went to college. And meanwhile, I did all the things, the AP classes, all of that, went to college. Didn't really know what I was going to do my first year. Ended up deciding on engineering school because I was really good at science and math. I loved physics. I had like the coolest physics teacher in high school. And meanwhile, I was dating this guy in the Marine Corps. He went through like some injury. He went to Iraq. I think he went to one of the, I don't even remember at this point. He did a tour, and like before I started dating him, and I kind of didn't know at the time, but he definitely came back with trauma from that deployment. And then later in a training after the deployment, he broke an ankle and got prescribed pain pills for this ankle break. And that was the sort of start of his addiction. Meanwhile, I started college a couple hours away. We were long distance for that like year or so. And then he kind of devolved into addiction. This was like 2012, which is when, if you're familiar with like the opioid epidemic, this was when they were switching to supposed to be like abuse proof, the pills that they sold. And what that ended up doing was making a lot of people switch from snorting pills to IV injecting them around 2012, and which just made the heroin epidemic like boom around this time. And so I think looking back on it, I'm like, I just didn't really have the tools, I suppose, to navigate a healthy relationship and healthy boundaries, because I was, doing well for myself in college. I was like in honors college. I got accepted into engineering school, which was a big deal. Like, that's not really necessarily an easy thing to do. And I was just in this codependent relationship with this guy who was going down his own path of addiction, to the point where I just got desensitized to his using and started using. And it was just the most out of left field thing for like a lot of people that knew me, because I was kind of this like, even like I ended up in rehab later, and even folks in rehab were like, you don't really belong here. You're this like little blonde white chick. I don't know. And so anyway, stereotypes, whatever, addiction doesn't discriminate. To spare the gruesome details, it took me like in 2013, I overdosed on heroin for the first time. And that was like the start of the worst, the badness of it. And I went sort of through this, like, I was still in engineering school using IV opiates, and I actually like never failed out of engineering school. I was still like going and like holding down jobs. I was like what you might call a high functioning addict, but I was like sticking needles in my arms, and it was bad. It was awful. And meanwhile, in high school, this is like an important part of my story, I suppose. In high school, I had yoga was like a big hobby of mine. I just started doing yoga at a gym. But of course, my family was like, that's not like a real career, like exercise science. I was like, oh, I can do exercise science and make that like how I make yoga a real career, which is funny. That's what I kind of ended up doing anyway. But at the time they were like, that's not a real career, choose something different. So that's how I ended up in engineering school. And I just got like so bad off on drugs that my mom like staged an intervention on me, made me move in with her, made me like cut off contact with the guy. That of course didn't work. I still found ways to like, talk to him under her nose and still use under her nose, because I wasn't ready yet. And so it took a couple years of me, like my mom making me move in with her, and she would like drop me off at class, because she worked in the same town where I was going to school and stuff. And it still didn't work until eventually I got arrested for just some druggy stuff, like whatever. I ended up in jail. And then from there, I went to rehab to like get the charges dropped. It was like, if you go to this rehab, you can get the charges dropped, which is how a lot of people ended up in the rehab that I was in. It was a 2-year-long program. It is one of the few that is free. It costs like $400 one time, but that fee gets waived for a lot of people. And so a lot of rehabs are extremely expensive and they require super bougie insurance. This was not one of those. This was like, my mom thought it was like summer camp because they made it sound like summer camp, but it was not summer camp. Anyway, so I went to this rehab and I was there for a year, ended up relapsing after I left there. But the sort of point is, when I was in that rehab, sort of the only options were like AA and NA meetings, and they just made us work all the time. It was kind of like a slave camp. That's why it was free, this place. And we didn't really do groups or anything, right? Like at this rehab. And I came home, relapsed after a few months of being, out of this place. And it was actually when I tried to go back to engineering school. So I was just like, am I going to keep hanging on to this? So, so like I didn't go back to the guy or anything, you know what I mean? After rehab, I did have another like super codependent and abusive relationship sort of in the meanwhile. But so that's like a big part of my story, is the like navigating those relationships that I ultimately learned that I think it was sort of like daddy issues causing that, with those relationships that ultimately led me to like do things that I might not have otherwise done. But it all sort of comes down to that trauma. So like that trauma of my parents' divorce, trauma of things my dad did afterwards, right? Trauma of things that happened while I was using, things I saw, things I did, you know what I mean? And then after leaving the rehab and relapsing again and getting another charge, and having this time, I was doing a program to go to an IOP to get the charge sort of dropped or whatever, an intensive outpatient program. And in that program, I was living in the town that I used in, and I started going to yoga again. And so yoga was sort of the piece that helped me stay clean. Like I've been clean since that time, and that was 2016. And I wondered why that didn't work when why yoga worked when my mom's intervention didn't work, when intense, like a year-long inpatient rehab didn't work, when AA and NA didn't work. Why was it this little piddly like drug program? Was it that, or was it that I found my way back to yoga, this like court-ordered drug you know what I mean? And I found my way back to yoga. And so to make the rest of it, it's kind of like, and the rest is history. I went to yoga teacher training. I saved up for it as a waitress instead of, I was like, okay, engineering school doesn't seem good to me. Yoga teacher training has been a long time dream of mine. So I'm just going to do that kind of like in the meantime while I figure out what I'm really going to do. You know what I mean? And here I am, was that 7 years later, still a yoga teacher, like making it my career to be a yoga teacher. And I ultimately like have a loving husband and all that family support now that I was sort of lacking at the time. But to make the rest of that long story short, what I found with yoga was the reason a lot of mental health diagnoses are people's coping mechanisms that become deeply ingrained patterns after having experienced trauma. And everybody experiences trauma. People deal with it differently. And the reason that yoga helps, and this is something I discovered through undergraduate research and lots of other work I've done since starting my yoga teaching career, is that yoga connects people back to their body awareness. After experiencing trauma, it does not feel safe to be in your body, and connects people back to their emotional awareness. That is often what people are numbing when they start using drugs or something. They're numbing some like tougher emotions. And so that's the reason ultimately why yoga is so healing. And so, so that's why I'm like, it's important to me to share that story, because if I had just known that earlier, you know what I mean, kind of thing, maybe my life would be different, but it's okay. I like my life now. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Wow, there's a lot in there and so much I could ask questions about, but I think we could go in all kinds of tangents. So the things that I was particularly struck by was this dichotomy. I don't even know if that's the right word, of you talk about being busy, accomplished in all kinds of activities, good student, the Christian Bible, religious background, whatever that was, with your family and everything. And the night and day versions, right? Like day is that, and night is this image that we as a society have of someone who is dealing with an addiction. And particularly, yes, you were functional, and you said you were functional. through most of it, but to the point of overdose and arrests and other things like that. Did you, what in the midst of all this, do you even know what was your identity? Like, how did you see yourself?
That's a good question. I think honestly, a lot of, and this is, so Nikki Myers she does like Y12SR. She founded Y12SR. And that's what I think she calls codependency. Maybe she didn't, I mean, I just remember hearing this from her. I don't know if she coined the phrase, but codependency is sort of like an addiction is like a disease of the lost self, So it's like, I don't even know, which is interesting because then also yoga is like, we don't need to identify as all of our roles. Like now I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a yoga teacher. And I don't necessarily now like identify myself as those things. I have that deep spiritual connection. It's one of the things that I don't know that I could put words to, but I know it when I feel it. But then I don't know. I think I was just bound up in those roles. I was like, I'm in engineering school and that makes me good, and I have this like on paper, like I grew up near Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which is now called something else, Fort Liberty. I don't know. I don't live there anymore, but I gather that there's like local politics about that. Anyway, I grew up near an Army base. So dating a guy in the Marine Corps was like good. You know what I mean? It was like, that's a good thing to do, is like be the all-American girl, athletic, like, get good grades. Those were the things that made me feel good about myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I just think I wrapped my identity up in those roles. Whereas now it's more of like, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a spirit, like I identify with the spiritual connection that I feel like when
It's
I'm in nature.
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I think that you've talked around it in terms of the codependency piece. And codependency is really feeling like we are in a lot of ways responsible for other people's happiness, right? And so you taking on all of these things, dating a guy in the military, being a good student, being an athlete, being all the things that were, a good daughter, a good student, a good girlfriend, a good member of society, whatever that looks like for where you were, it's almost like your identity was to be that good person.
Yeah. Totally.
And I can totally see that. I loved that description. And Nikki Myers, is that who you say it?
That's who I remember hearing it from.
Okay.
I'm the queen of like butchering quotes.
Oh,
but
I have to look them up all the time.
Yeah.
So I love that description of codependency because it did give me that insight into, it's not our identity. It's the identity that we take on because we think we need to be that for others in order for them to love us or to accept us or to keep them happy. Which I think is a big reason too, why people fall into all kinds of addictions, because we're not paying attention to what's really going on. We're in denial of who we are and what's going on in us. And so we push it away. I've talked about this in my book and on the podcast. One of my addictions, because I have an addictive personality, has been food since I was 3 years old. And it was because emotions didn't feel safe and being myself didn't feel safe. And so whatever the addiction is, and like, there's no hierarchy of addictions. I'm just putting it out there because they're coping mechanisms, and whatever can make us feel good. I did, knowing that I had an addictive personality. There were times where I was like, I'm never going to drink alone. I'm never going to do this. I'm not even going to open that door because I know I have an addictive personality. Right. But if you don't know, or if people around you are doing it, it does become kind of normalized. And
totally.
You used the phrase desensitized.
Yeah.
So you talk about why you learned and how you learned how yoga worked for you.
Yeah.
There was something that kept drawing you back to yoga. Do you think that innately you knew that was your answer, or do you think it was something else?
No, I think it was just the first thing that I loved because I loved it, not because like somebody near me loved it or because, you know what I mean? Like, I grew up swimming because my granddad was a swimmer and my best friend down the street was a swimmer. And that's how I ended up swimming. And I love swimming too. And I was even a swim coach for a while, like after, like since getting clean. The only reason I stopped being a swim coach was because I had kids and it's not really compatible with toddlers, and I was like, maybe I'll go back to it when my kids are on the team. But anyways, it was really probably the first thing that I love. And astrology, the same. I work astrology into my yoga work now because astrology to me brings in that emotional awareness piece, just in a way that yoga by itself is a little bit harder to, like, astrology just makes it easy. And astrology was also, it was like a guilty pleasure growing up. Like anytime I could get my hands on like a newspaper horoscope, I loved it. On my very first smartphone, like one of the first apps I downloaded was an astrology app or a horoscope app. You know what I mean? So it's just like that kind of stuff has always been like, that's just like where my interests lie. It's what I like. If I'm just following like what I enjoy and not what, like, like dirt bikes and motorcycles. My family rides motorcycles. My husband rides dirt bikes. I enjoy it. Doesn't mean I enjoy it less, but like on my own accord, I might not do it as much if the people around me weren't doing it. You know what I mean?
Right. There's so many good things that I wish I could remember them all, but I'm just wanted to ask you, you talked about why it's important for you to share your story, but what do you hope people learn or take away from your experience?
So I suppose that it's, like I sort of touched on that, like, if I had only learned this stuff earlier, that maybe like my life would have turned out differently. But I don't know that that's necessarily like a good thing, because like you were saying, is like, maybe I would have kept on that lifestyle of doing the right things and like being perfect. If things had just like worked out a little bit differently, I might have ended up becoming an engineer and I might have been very successful, but I probably would have still had that like pain and suffering within, like, inside me. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to point out, is that whether you resonate with like having been through trauma, like big T trauma, traumatic events, little T trauma, like chronic stress, whatever, whether that lands with any given listener or not, we all suffer. Like, that's like Buddhist philosophy, like life is suffering. This stuff is weird and wild and it doesn't make sense and it's hard and there's no like easy way out. And the sort of like if we can let go of those identities, this is what my mom even talks about it. She's a lawyer, and lawyers have like a high rate of suicide because a lot of them, overly identify with their profession, kind of, to a degree. Anyway, so it's just like, if I could give one takeaway, it's that, it's okay to completely like blow up your life. I'm actually maybe like happier for it. You know what I mean? My family said, like, they came around. You just can't get stuck there. And you have to find some way to deal with the suffering, some healthy outlet. And in my opinion, it's like, if you can find something that provides community, body awareness, and emotional awareness, it doesn't have to be the same thing providing all three. It just happens for me that yoga and astrology do all three for me. But if you have like, I don't know, a fishing community, but you also work out and journal, I don't, like, it could be anything, but we all, I think, need that, because there's like, life is suffering. Like, everybody, you're going to go through hard stuff. You're never going to not go through hard stuff. And so we have to have some sort of like practice. It's simple, but not easy, right? Like, that's a
totally
saying.
Nobody is immune from hardship.
Yeah.
And I think the older we get, the more we recognize that it becomes like the thing that levels the playing field. Early in our lives, there's a lot of hierarchy and, who's cool, who's not cool, who's popular, who's not, all those things. But we reach a point where it's like, oh, everybody's been through something. And so it kind of makes us all more equal, because we can all relate to the fact that everyone's had something hard. Okay, one fun question. If there was to be a book or a movie about your life, what would it be called?
Oh, okay. Give me a second to think about this one.
Yep, no problem. I'm springing it on you. So
yeah, that's a hard one. I got to think of something good. What would it be called?
Whatever's jumping into your mind.
I feel like it would have the word resilient in it because I love that word. What's coming to me is like resilient journeys, but I think that's the name of like something already.
Oh,
but
well, there's a lot of things that have the same names. It's funny because I keep seeing that light behind you that says radiant.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I like resilient journey, like that leads to radiance or something
Radiant
like that.
Resilience.
Yeah.
I like that.
So there you go. There's your book title.
Well, so I call my daughter my sunshine girl, and my mom has always called me her Rosie Sunshine because my name's Rosemary Rose and my whole family calls me Rosie. So it's just like, there's always been some element of that sunshine vibes. Even, you know, I was a beach girl in a past life. Now I live in the mountains. But anyway, like radiant, resilient. Ooh, I like that.
There you go.
I'm gonna keep it.
I love that. Okay, so as we wrap up, how can people find you if they want to know more about your journey or what you're doing and how you mix yoga and astrology?
So if anybody wants to like go down a rabbit hole and hear my journey sort of unfold in real time, the very first episode, I have 2 podcasts. One is called Yogi Scopes, YOGISCOPES, like yoga horoscopes. And I post a weekly Vedic astrology update with yoga practices and journal prompts every week for the current Vedic astrology happenings. So that's like pretty niche. You have to, like, I've learned that people have to be like really far down the yoga rabbit hole to like care about that. Turns out most people that listen to that podcast are already yoga teachers. But the podcast that I started first was called The Science of Light, because that's with my engineering background, and like science is pretty important to me. Anyway, you could go back and listen to the very first episode of that podcast, and like my voice was shaking. It is like probably not a comfortable listen, especially after listening to this. It's like an hour long, so it's like a drawn out version of the same story I just told. But it's important because you can go back and listen to that and hear the quality and the sort of skill I had at podcasting versus maybe sort of like the comfort I have on microphone and on camera now versus then. And it's just, I like to leave it out there because I'm like, if you think for some reason that you could never like do this, go back and listen to that. And yes, you can. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. That's how I feel about my first episodes too. I must have recorded the first episode 100 times and it's only like 7 minutes, maybe less. I don't even remember. But yeah, I was just like, oh, I don't like the way that sounds, or, oh, I made that mistake. I can do it again. I can do it better. Yeah. Yeah,
totally. So you could check out that podcast if you wanted to hear more about my story. And then also some earlier episodes of The Science of Light. I detailed some of this stuff that I learned and like the undergraduate research that I did. And so some of it's like a long listen. You know what I mean? And I'm working on now. I'm actually hoping to relaunch that podcast to have like just better for the listeners episodes. You know what I mean? But if you're into astrology and want to nerd out, you could check out the Yogi Scopes podcast.
Hey,
I'd also be happy to connect on social media. I'm Yogi Scopes on all the platforms, or you could,
Well, we'll make sure that our show notes have all those links so that people can find you, whether they're watching us on YouTube or listening through Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. It will be in the show notes, so people should be able to access that, and on our Facebook page.
Thank you. You know what?
Oh,
one more thing. I have a profile on Insight Timer that's just under my name, Rosemary Holbrook. And so I have some meditations there that might be helpful to what I'm talking about, to how like connecting back to that emotional awareness, which is like so healing for trauma. I have some meditations on there that might be helpful.
Awesome.
For general listeners.
I use Insight Timer just about every day. So highly recommend it. Again, links will be in the show notes. Thank you for being with us, Rosemary. It's been awesome. And again, I still have so many questions. So we might need to have you back.
I'm up for it. So
awesome.
Thanks for doing this important work.
Thank you.